welcome to our lesson 32 in the e-learning program, and this is week 7. As usual, I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Mwesiga Hilary, a teacher of English Primary 6 at Mother Marjorie Primary School. Now, I'll also not forget to remind you to be cautious about the COVID-19 guidelines. Try to follow them up, because this is a serious sickness, so I didn't love any one of us to be infected by it. Now, I start by reminding you about our interview dates for those new entrants who would love to join Mother Marjorie for the academic year 2021. Our interviews, we started them in December, and we shall be having others on 9th of January 2021. We shall have another set on 16th January 2021, and finally 23rd January 2021. Encourage a neighbor who has interest in Mother Marjorie to come and do interviews from classes nursery to P6. Well, we proceed with our lesson 32, and in lesson 32 we have been given a family tree. Study the family tree below and answer the questions about it. Study the family tree below and answer the questions about it. Now, when you come across such a family tree, remember we are in family relationships, so we want to see what we call the different people we have been discussing. How do you come to arrive at a decision to call someone uncle? Because I know when you are in P1 or nursery, every male you would see would be uncle, every female you see is auntie, but now I want you to differentiate them. You know, this is my uncle, this is my cousin, this is my nephew. So we are going to study that family tree, try to answer those questions so that we can be aware of the relationships we have in our families, or how we are related to the different people in our families. Now, I start by reading. Study the family tree below and answer questions about it. Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale, those arrows indicate that where the arrow points, that shows that that's a son of the one above. So Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale produced Mr. Asimwe and Mrs. Okello. Then Mr. and Mrs. Asimwe produced Vivian and Brian. We got that plus means those two are married. Mrs. Okello is married to Mr. Okello. So we have another family, Mr. and Mrs. Opio, where we have Mr. Okello, we have Rose, Sarah, and Peter. Then there should be another arrow down from Mr. Okello to Shaban. So we can start with question 1. What is shown above? What is shown above? So for us to answer that question, we shall say a family tree is shown above. A family tree is shown above. That's how we answer questions in English. Then question 2, who is Mr. Asimwe's father? Who is Mr. Asimwe's father? Who is Mr. Asimwe's father? Now from that arrow we realize that Mr. Ayebale is Mr. Asimwe's father. From Mr. Asimwe's you put an apostrophe to show that father is for Asimwe. That apostrophe shows ownership or possession of something. So we say Mr. Ayebale is Mr. Asimwe's father. Mr. Ayebale is Mr. Asimwe's father. Question 3. How is Moses related to Rose? 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 If you can clearly look at the arrow I told you between Okello and Shaban, there should be an arrow moving down. So, how is Moses related to Rose? We can say Moses is the nephew of Rose. 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 Or you can say Moses is Rose's nephew. Moses is Rose's nephew, or Moses is the nephew of Rose. Who is a nephew? A nephew is a son of your brother. A nephew is a son of your brother. What do you call a daughter of your brother? A daughter of your brother is called your niece. But clearly we can see that Moses is the nephew of Rose. And why don't we say that Moses is a nephew to Rose? When you say Moses is a nephew to Rose, that means that Moses treats Rose as if like his aunt. But to show that they are related by blood, you say Moses is a nephew of Rose. Now we can try to go through these other questions. What is the relationship between Mrs. Okello and Mr. Asimwe? What is the relationship between Mrs. Okello and Mr. Asimwe? We can say Mrs. Okello is the sister of. Mrs. Okello is the sister of Asimwe. Mrs. Okello is the sister of Mr. Asimwe. Mrs. Okello is the sister of Mr. Asimwe. Why do we say that they are Mrs. Okello is the sister? You can clearly see from the family tree that Mr. Okello married the sister of Mr. Asimwe, and that's how she came to be called Mrs. Okello. So we say, what is the relationship between Mrs. Okello and Mr. Asimwe? We say Mrs. Okello is the sister of Mr. Asimwe. Not a sister to, but a sister of. Then we can go to another question. What is the relationship between Vivian and Mrs. Ayebale? What is the relationship between Vivian and Mrs. Ayebale? We say Vivian is the granddaughter of Mrs. Ayebale. Vivian is the granddaughter of Mrs. Ayebale. Granddaughter of, not granddaughter to. Remember, granddaughter to means Vivian treats Mrs. Ayebale as her grandmother. But when you say it's a granddaughter of, that means biologically she is the grandmother. So we say Vivian is the granddaughter of Mrs. Asimwe. Question 6. How many cousins does Brian have? How many cousins does Brian have? How many cousins does Brian have? In the first place, we identify where Brian is, and Brian has a sister called Vivian. Then the cousins now, they are the children of Brian's uncles, the likes of Shaban, Daphne, Moses, and Sharon. So we can say Brian has 4 cousins. Brian has 4 cousins. Your cousin is a son or daughter of your uncle or aunt. So we say Brian has 4 cousins. Brian has 4 cousins. Then how many grandchildren? How many grandchildren do Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale have? We shall count them. We have Vivian, Brian, Shaban, Daphne, Moses, and Sharon. So those are, how many grandchildren do Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale have? We say Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale have 6 grandchildren. Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale have 6 grandchildren. We can count them: 1 Vivian, 2 Brian, 3 Shaban, 4 Daphne, 5 Moses, 6 Sharon. So we say Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale have 6 grandchildren. Mr. and Mrs. Ayebale have 6 grandchildren. How many grandsons does Mr. Opio have? How many grandsons does Mr. Opio have? There we have to cross-check through the names, because some names are for females, others for males. For example, I don't expect any boy to be called Vivian. So Vivian can't be a grandson, she's a granddaughter. Brian, that's a grandson. Shaban, grandson. Daphne, I don't expect a boy to be called Daphne. Moses, Sharon. So from those 3 names, we realize that Mr. Opio has 3 grandsons. Mr. Opio has 3 grandsons basing on the names. Mr. Opio has 3 grandsons. Then how is Shaban related to Mr. Opio? Shall say Shaban is the grandson of Mr. Opio. Shaban is the grandson of Mr. Opio. The next question is, what is the relationship between Mrs. Okello and Peter? What is the relationship between Mrs. Okello and Peter? We say Mrs. Okello is the sister-in-law of Peter. Mrs. Okello is the sister-in-law of Peter, or Mrs. Okello is Peter's sister-in-law. Peter's, remember to put an apostrophe between R and S, Peter's. Mrs. Okello is Peter's sister-in-law, or Mrs. Okello is the sister-in-law of Peter. What does Vivian call Mr. Asimwe? Vivian calls Mr. Asimwe his father. Vivian calls Mr. Asimwe his father. Finally, give the opposite of the word nephew. The opposite of the word nephew is niece. Most of you like spelling it as nice, but niece is N-I-E-C-E. That is niece, opposite of nephew. Who is a niece? A niece is a daughter of your brother or sister. A daughter of your brother or sister is your niece. And then what does your niece call? Your niece will be calling you his aunt, her aunt, or her uncle. So that has been our lesson 32. I believe you've learned a great deal of things from the family tree, and I want you now to start practicing that as you call people. Don't say my young mother, referring to aunt or uncle. I know it's a habit commonly with children. So once again, I thank you for attending my lesson, my subsequent lessons, and I pray that God blesses you through this pandemic. And I also wish you the best as we meet in the next lesson. May God bless you. Oh, Madam